Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's special guest lecture, The Sport and Prey of Capitalists, How the Rich Are Stealing Canada's Public Wealth. My name is Mary Varakis, Program Manager for Programs for 50 Plus and Community Engagement at the Chang School. And I'm very pleased to co-host today's special lecture presentation along with Deborah Bonk-Greenwood, Executive Director from our partner organization, the Life Institute. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge the land on which Ryerson University is built upon. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I would like to also pay my respects to the Indigenous peoples, elders, and ancestors who stewarded and cared for the land on which Ryerson University is located today. At the university, we've made a deep and long-lasting commitment to truth and reconciliation, and I invite you to learn more about this online. Now, I'd like to go over just a few quick items on how to participate in today's workshop. Please ensure that your microphone is muted so as not to disturb other attendees or our presenter today. Please refrain from having your video on. However, if you do choose to keep your video on, that is fine, but please be mindful that your actions on your camera are visible to all attendees during today's workshop. For the hearing impaired, we also have automated captioning available, which you can access by activating in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. You will have an opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the chat box of the control panel. You may send in your questions when prompted by the presenter during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Please note that the opinions expressed in the event today by our speaker do not necessarily express the views and opinions of Ryerson University. The information presented in today's workshop and lecture is for general information purposes only. I would now like to introduce our guest speaker, Linda McQuaig, for today's special lecture and workshop. Journalist and best-selling author Linda McQuaig has been a rare voice of dissent within the mainstream media. Since 2002, she has written an op-ed column for the Toronto Star, challenging the prevailing economic dogma and championing a more equal and inclusive society. Winner of a National Newspaper Award for investigative reporting, she's also author of 8 national bestsellers, including Shooting the Hippo, Death by Deficit, and Other Canadian Myths, which was selected as one of the 25 most influential books of the past 25 years by the Literary Review of Canada. Her latest book is The Sport and Prey of Capitalists, How the Rich Are Stealing Canada's Public Wealth, which is the topic for today's presentation. Welcome, Linda McQuaig.
Thank you very much, Mary. It's a great pleasure to be here again. I enjoyed my last visit, which was a few years ago. Very different. I remember we were all in the same room and nobody was wearing a mask. What a different world. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here today. And if I could just add one quick biographical detail to what Mary just said about me, I just want to point out I ran for politics twice for the NDP. In fact, in this very riding, Toronto Centre. And I ran against 2 people who ended up being finance ministers, Bill Morneau and Chrystia Freeland. And I remember when you two are so similar, you both wrote books about the rich, but I'm not so sure about that. I mean, Freeland's book kind of ends up arguing that the rich are really doing a good job running the world, whereas my book is more about how the world would be better off if there were no billionaires at all. But I guess that's why she's finance minister and I'm with you here today. Anyway, I am delighted to be here. I want to talk today about privatization, which I think really is kind of the economic dogma of our times. And it's the subject that I've explored in my new book, The Sport and Prey of Capitalists. What I really try and do is look at Canada and Canadian history kind of through a different lens, through a public lens. My argument is Canada has a really impressive history of public services. We certainly know about that, healthcare and education being the primary ones, but also of what I call public enterprises. That is publicly owned power plants, publicly owned national railway, publicly owned broadcaster, publicly owned pharmaceutical company, and even public banks. This is a kind of a fascinating history that we don't know too much about. That in fact, while the US succeeded, you could argue, as a nation that specialized in private enterprise, Canada tended to succeed more as a nation that triumphed with public enterprise. And that reflects our different geography, our different history, and our different culture. Typically the desire for these public services and public enterprises, I think it grew out of a desire in Canada for more popular control, not letting things be controlled by the marketplace. The argument being that, some services, some needs we have are so important to our well-being. We can't just leave them to the marketplace because we can't trust them to the whims of the people who control the marketplace. I think a good example of this goes all the way back to the 1890s. That was the age of the discovery of water power. They figured out how to harness, falling water and, transfer it into electricity and transport it over fairly long distances. This was an incredible breakthrough and really transformed society. This was an incredibly new source of power. And it quickly became dominated by what became known as water barons. These are, powerful business interests that controlled the new electricity. And they took control all over the US and became exceptional. They were the tech giants of their day. But up in Canada, something very different happened. Certainly the big water barons were very interested in getting control of Niagara Falls. That was the ultimate power source for electricity. And they assumed they'd get control of it just the way they had in the States. But what ended up happening was a popular movement arose in Canada, in Ontario. And these were ordinary people, as well as small business operators, who didn't want this important new source of power to be controlled by the big, powerful water barons, because then they could control the price, they could control access. So instead, the popular movement in Canada, and this didn't exist in the United States, but this popular movement became really quite strong, tens of thousands of people involved in it. And what they wanted was what they called public power, not water baron control power, but public power. And there was an epic battle that went on for more than 10 years. And the amazing thing is, in the end, the popular movement won. And that's, of course, how we got Ontario Hydro. And Ontario Hydro was an enormous breakthrough. It was the first public power installation, first public power company in North America. It was publicly owned, and it really became the key to Ontario's competitiveness. And it was so impressive and broke so many new, established so many new ways of harnessing this important new source of power. It actually became a model for Franklin Roosevelt in the 1930s when he was doing the New Deal, and he created those enormous public power plants like the Tennessee Valley Authority. Roosevelt was a big fan of Ontario Hydro, and he acknowledged that he was inspired by the hydro example. Anyway, that's just one of the important public enterprises in Ontario and Canada. And sadly, in recent years, of course, we've seen with not just with Ontario Hydro, but with other of our very important public enterprises as well, what's happened is the Canadian business and political elite has bought into the neoliberal agenda, that the Reaganomics, which is all about the primacy of the market and rewarding the people who dominate the market, and austerity for everyone else. And one of the key elements of this is privatization. So sadly, we've sold off so much of our really valuable public enterprises. And it's all based on the business credo that the private sector always does things better. Is that a problem on the speaker system? I'm hearing a little echo. Is that just me?
It's fine for me.
Oh, okay, all right, then I'll just continue. Yeah, so the privatization, it's all based on the credo that the private sector always does things better, which of course our politicians and our business leaders, they always assert that with great confidence, although never with any proof. In fact, if you look at the actual evidence, you find that it's not at all true that the private sector always does things better. In fact, they often do things much worse and much more expensively. Let me just take the example of the privatization of the 407 highway. I mean, that highway, of course, was built by Bob Rae's government. It was constructed with with the intention that it would be a toll road, but that the tolls would be removed once the construction was paid for, and it become part of the highway system of Ontario, with everybody having equal access to it the way we do with all our other roads. But what ended up happening was Mike Harris got elected and he privatized it. He sold it to a foreign consortium for $3 billion. It's now worth well over $30 billion. And with the cost of the land added in, more like $100 billion. But so we got a terrible, terrible deal. But the real problem isn't just we got a terrible deal. It's that we no longer control a key part of our transportation system. In fact, the deal that we signed with the consortium that the Harris government signed involved a 99-year lease, 99 years, which is till the year 2098. And yet in that lease, we demanded no control over how high the tolls could go. So, it should have been obvious what was going to happen. And what did happen is we've ended up on the 407 with tolls that are among the highest tolls in the world anywhere. Whereas, let me just point out, if we had kept the 407 as a publicly owned highway, those tolls would have been canceled by now because we more than paid for the construction. So we would all now be able to drive on that road in a much more egalitarian way, not just the rich getting to get through all the traffic quickly, but everyone. Or for that matter, we could have kept the tolls on. We could have made a democratic decision that we wanted those tolls, but we wanted to direct them to something important, public transit or healthcare, all kinds of important things. Instead, what we did was we made this privatization deal over which we have no control, not even over how high the tolls go. So what we're going to be doing, for the next 8 decades until the year 2098, we're going to be paying ever higher tolls. And so, by 2098, I'm imagining that most of us here today will probably be too old to celebrate the end of this terrible deal. Anyway, the 407 is sort of a dramatic example of how costly privatization is. It's going to cost us tens of billions, cost Ontarians tens of billions in extra toll fees. But we can also look in a more systematic way at the cost of privatization. The Auditor General in Ontario did a study back in 2014 looking at P3s, the public-private partnerships, which are really just forms of privatization or privatized infrastructure developments. She looked at 74 of the infrastructure developments in Ontario, these P3 infrastructure developments, and she concluded that if we hadn't done those as P3s, if we'd done them in the traditional way with the government doing it itself, not involving a private partner who had to make a profit. She said, if we'd done it that way, we would have saved, the government of Ontario would have saved $8 billion, $8 billion. I mean, you just get a sense of the scope of how much more we've been spending. And it's not a big surprise when you think about it. The P3 deals, all that happens there, it's the normal way to develop infrastructure, except now we involve a private partner who has a built-in profit margin in the deal of 7 to 9%. Well, of course, it's going to drive up our costs. It would be hard not for it to do that. So privatization really is just an enormous scam in many ways, just siphoning public money into private profits. But I want to argue that, the negative consequences of it, really go well beyond just the money we're losing, as bad as that is. Probably more important is the compromise it makes in protecting the public interest. We set up these public enterprises and services because we want to protect some important public interest. And when you privatize it, you lose that public interest focus. And this is particularly serious, I would argue, during a pandemic when we need that public protection more than ever. And just here's an example that we're all very familiar with, the long-term care fiasco. Long-term care, of course, nursing homes. And they're a perfect example of a service that, we made a public service because, you're dealing with very vulnerable citizens. We can't trust their care, or we shouldn't trust their care to the private marketplace, the whims of the, greedy corporations in the private marketplace. So that, that was the logic originally. But when Mike Harris came along, the privatizing guy, in the 90s, he effectively privatized the nursing home business. And of course, this was at a time where the aging population was becoming more and more of an issue. And so there was an opportunity for business to get in there and make a lot of money. Aging population, and the whole area, the whole field was government subsidized. Business loves getting in on things where there's government subsidies because there's always a way for them to work it so they get some of that benefit. And Mike Harris made it even more lucrative for them. He removed the minimum staff requirements allowed at an individual nursing home. So that meant Well, I mean, think about how crazy that is. Staff is probably the most important thing in a nursing home because you need good staff and you need lots of people, lots of staff to take care of the people in the homes. But under this Mike Harris change, the nursing homes could scrimp on the staff costs, therefore getting higher profit. And so this was extremely attractive. And the LTC, the long-term care industry, was soon dominated by big corporate chains. And there were lots of problems. But it wasn't really until the pandemic that we see just how terrible the problems are. The long-term care homes became death traps. 3,700 residents of Ontario long-term care homes have died of COVID. And the death rates have been significantly higher in the for-profit homes and in these corporate chains. In fact, the death rates have been 78% higher in the private for-profit homes than in the remaining public and charitable homes. Okay, so that's 78% higher than the nonprofit homes. And even higher than that, the death rates have been even higher in what are called financialized firms. These are firms, and many of the corporate chains are like this, that are essentially private equity operations. And we know private equity is all about financial, high finance, financial maneuvering, and squeezing every penny out of an operation. Somebody described financialized firms as profit making on steroids. But think about that. Here we are with profit making on steroids allowed in our homes for the most vulnerable. I mean, what could possibly go wrong? It's hard to believe that this wasn't spotted as just an enormous problem. In fact, it was spotted as an enormous business opportunity. And first of all, by Mike Harris himself. He stepped down as premier in 2002. And the following year, he became chairman of one of these financialized chains known as Chartwell. And Chartwell has become one of the biggest chains operating long-term care homes in Ontario. And over the past decade, Chartwell has paid out to its shareholders $800 million. This is a government subsidized business. And at the same time, over the last decade, they've paid out $50 million to their executives. And then that includes Mike Harris, who makes $237,000 a year at his part-time position as chairman. Anyway, I think the privatization of the long-term care industry is just an incredible example of the horror that can accompany privatization and trusting the market in places where it's so inappropriate to do so. Just increased deaths. We've had 3,700 deaths. You wonder how many of those could have been avoided if we'd had more publicly run care homes. So that to me is a pretty damning consideration. And while we're at it, another example of a very foolish privatization, which has been highlighted by the pandemic, is a situation, well, it was right here in Toronto, that we used to have one of the world's leading vaccine makers. And it was owned by the people of Canada. The story goes back to 1913, when there was a terrible epidemic of diphtheria, very, horrible disease that affected children. Canadian children were dying at a terrible rate. And what was particularly tragic about it was that there was a treatment available, but it was expensive, and only the families of the rich could afford it. So there was a Toronto doctor by the name of John Fitzgerald who set out to change this. He did experiments on a horse in a barn, and he came up with an antitoxin that could treat diphtheria based on sort of current knowledge of science in the area. And then with the help of the University of Toronto, he created what became known as Connaught Labs, which then just, produced and distributed this diphtheria treatment. And it was extremely successful. It was done through the provincial health agencies at very low cost. And it was so successful that they decided to continue and make affordable treatments for other diseases like typhoid fever, tetanus, meningitis. And so Connaught Labs was established with the specific goal to make medicine available and accessible to all. Very different goal than private pharmaceutical companies. And so for the next 7 decades, Connaught Labs was actually a phenomenal success story. Something we as Canadians should be so proud of. I mean, it produced affordable medications for all kinds of deadly diseases and saved countless lives as a result. And totally unlike the pharmaceutical industry, Connaught Labs, it had very high qualified scientists that did research, but the research was not based on what would be a profitable drug to develop. It was based on what did humans need? What were the needs in the human health field, and how could Connaught best address those needs? So as a result of this amazingly different orientation and the high quality people that it attracted, Connaught ended up contributing to really some of the key medical breakthroughs of the 20th century. Of course, the development of insulin, penicillin, the polio vaccine, and it also played an essential role in the global eradication of smallpox. In fact, when the World Health Organization was trying to eliminate smallpox, set that as its goal, it in the late 60s and early 70s, it turned to Connaught as to help it as a partner to help with this, because Connaught was so good at vaccines, developing them and producing them. And so the World Health Organization put Connaught in charge of the entire Western Hemisphere. But despite this really incredible performance by Connaught, Big Pharma had never liked it. They didn't like, Big Pharma didn't like the fact that Connaught sold its vaccines to provincial governments at cost and sold its vaccines and other treatments around the world for very low prices. They didn't like that because that showed up how inflated and how ridiculously high their prices were. And by the way, even with those incredibly low prices, Connaught was completely self-sufficient. It didn't require funding from government. In fact, it made a profit. It made enough profit to invest in its own research and to invest in other research at the university. Anyway, despite this just stunning list of accomplishments, the Mulroney government privatized Connaught in the 1980s. And to me, this is just a stunningly foolish idea. I mean, imagine what Connaught could be doing today in terms of the COVID vaccine and the whole pandemic. As I mentioned, Connaught had become a world leader in vaccines. developing its own vaccines for diphtheria, whooping cough, smallpox, tetanus, and also working with other scientists to develop other vaccines. For instance, the polio vaccine developed by Dr. Salk in the US. It just strikes me that if we hadn't privatized Connaught that had been a world leader back then, would probably have been at the forefront of developing a COVID vaccine. And it certainly, Connaught had just an enormous vaccine production capacity, and Canadians were always at the front of the line. But today, because of that privatization, instead of Connaught being owned by the people of Canada, and instead of it contributing to the advance of global medicine and putting human health before profits and developing and producing vaccines with Canadians at the front of the line, instead of all that, today, Connaught doesn't do any of those things. In fact, it's a mere branch plant of the French pharmaceutical giant Sanofi. What a tragedy. What an outrage. And just quickly, I just want to add about this. I can elaborate if you want in the question period, but you know, I mean, I'm certainly blaming Mulroney for the privatization, but you know, that's history. The real point is, it's not too late to recreate Connaught, recreate something like that. And the Trudeau government is absolutely not going in that direction. In fact, it recently announced it was investing $415 million, and Ontario was throwing in another 55. So it was almost $500 million of Canadian taxpayer money. It was going to invest in a private company, actually Sanofi of all things. But there's no guarantee of anything. We have no control over Sanofi. They have no deal with Sanofi even to, the idea is that this will protect us in the future, in future pandemics, that because Sanofi is producing them here, they'll give Canadians first dibs. But there's no guarantee of that. In fact, when the minister was announcing it, he made the point, well, we're working on a deal with Sanofi to guarantee Canadians first. Well, why wouldn't you get the deal nailed down before you announce it? Then you have no leverage to demand that. Anyway, my point is the Trudeau government's doing exactly the wrong thing, spending $500 million investing in the vaccine capacity of a private company when we could be using that money to build up our own vaccine capacity that we would actually own and control, just like we did with Connaught. You know, some people think that's too ambitious, but it wasn't too ambitious for the people that set up Connaught. And I think that's a podium that we should really be trying to own again. So clearly, I would argue there's always been a strong case for public ownership and control. But now I would argue that is even more the case. You know, given the two enormous crises we face with the pandemic and, of course, climate change, probably, you know, that is the real crisis we face. We need a strong public sphere more than ever. You know, for instance, if we look at something like climate change and the enormous changes we're going to need to develop, you know, an entirely new clean energy system, you know, a Green New Deal, as it's called, we can't rely on the private sector to do that. It would be, you know, just we would be throwing our fate up in the air. This is a situation that cries out for public collective action that we can control. Now, some people, of course, argue, well, we just can't afford that all that Green New Deal. And you can be sure that as soon as the pandemic is over, all the pressure will start up again from the deficit hawks, from all the right-wing business think tanks saying we've got to reduce the size of our debt. And I would argue that, we don't really have any choice about this. It's not a question, well, should we or shouldn't we invest like that? If we want to live on this earth in the future, we simply have to do that. So I think I would argue that what is really useful is for us to look at the World War II experience. The demands of World War II, the spending demands were enormous, but nobody said, oh, this is too expensive, we can't afford to fight Hitler. They spent what was needed, and what was needed was absolutely phenomenal. At the end of the war, the debt was enormous. It was the biggest debt proportionally that we've ever had before or since. It was 150% of GDP. But here's the interesting thing. Despite that enormous debt at the end of the war, there was no austerity. Coming out of the war, people were exuberant and, keen to get going, rebuilding their lives and their economy. And it was just the opposite of austerity. In fact, the government, after the war, kept spending. It expanded, created all kinds of new programs. It built infrastructure. And in the process, it racked up much more debt. But the interesting thing is, we never paid that debt down. Not any of it. What happened was the debt kept growing, but the economy grew faster. So what's called the debt burden became relatively lighter over time, and it's the debt burden that matters. So by the 1970s, for instance, all that debt accumulated during the war and after the war had kept growing, and it was all still there, hadn't been paid down, but it amounted to only 20% of GDP, not 150%, just 20%, because GDP had grown so much. And it wasn't considered a problem at all. Nobody was arguing that it should be paid down. And as I say, it never was. In fact, all that public investment actually laid the foundation for the thriving post-war economy that is often called the golden age of capitalism. It was the 30 years after the Second World War. It was a period of enormous prosperity, economic growth, economic equality, the rise of the middle class. And the point is that in many ways, today's situation is a bit like the end of the Second World War. We have a huge debt, although not nearly as big as the one after the Second World War proportionally to our economy. But we also have very low interest rates, and they're expected to stay low for quite a while. And what that means is that the economy can grow faster than the debt, as it did in the post-war period. And that's exactly what we must do. We must fight off the deficit hawks who want us just to pay down all this debt. That would be completely the wrong thing to do, because we can finance that debt so cheaply with the extremely low interest rates, and we should be focusing on getting the economy up and running again and making sure people are properly included in it. And in addition to support for people through the pandemic and rebuilding people's economic capabilities after the pandemic, we also, of course, have to invest in climate change. But, the good news is that will lay the foundation for the future clean energy economy that we're going to have if we want to keep living on this planet. So the good news is we can actually afford this, just as we did in the post-war period. And when I say that, we can afford it just as we did in the post-war period, I'm, leading into the fact that in the post-war period, governments collected a lot more tax revenue. And they did it mostly from the high income crowd. That's where the big change has been. The top marginal rate back then for very rich people was 90%. 90%, imagine that. And the corporate rates were much higher. And the simple truth is, if we're going to enlarge the public sector, as we must to do these incredibly important things, we're going to have to increase taxes. But the good news is that much of that increase, in fact, most of that tax increase can and should come from taxing the wealthy, because that's where the big wealth gains have gone, to the very top. And so, you know, I would very explicitly argue that Canada needs a wealth tax. You know, we have 45 billionaires in this country, dozens of mega millionaires. They're richer than they've ever been, particularly after the pandemic. And yet their fortunes are essentially untaxed. And it's striking that recent polling shows 79% of Canadians support support an annual wealth tax. That's a tax of 1% on assets, on stocks and bonds over $20 million. And, you know, you could set the rate higher if you wanted, as for instance, Senator Bernie Sanders and Senator Elizabeth Warren in the States have proposed higher wealth taxes. But the important thing to point out is that if you don't have $20 million sitting around in stocks and bonds, relax, this tax isn't going to affect you. It only affects the very, very rich. And you know, we really should be taking advantage of the big opening we're seeing these days. You know, it's a very significant development that for the first time in decades, there's a US administration that is serious about taxing the rich. The Biden administration has made some stunning proposals that actually would raise taxes significantly on the rich. Unlike, by the way, the Trudeau government that's just gonna, you know, slap a little luxury tax on yachts and luxury cars. That's a drop in the bucket. I mean, among other things, what the Biden administration is proposing is a global minimum corporate tax that would be a real game changer if other countries would cooperate. He's proposed this through the G7 and the OECD. He's trying to get countries to agree to this global corporate minimum tax. It involves cooperation. Interestingly, Germany and France are supporting it. Canada is not, which is so disappointing, because if they were to get an agreement in place for global corporate minimum tax, as Biden's proposing, it would effectively be the end of tax havens, which would be just enormously beneficial for the world. Now, of course, it's sometimes argued that it's wrong to tax the rich, that you know, they need huge incentives to motivate them to work so hard and be so innovative. You know, a wealth tax would destroy all that entrepreneurship. So rather than me trying to refute that, I want to close by quoting the late US multi-billionaire David Koch in a speech he made about entrepreneurship and how he became so rich. This is what he said. He said, "When I was a little boy, my father gave me an apple. I sold it for $5 and bought 2 more apples and sold them for $10. Then with that money, I bought 4 more apples and sold them for $20. I continued to do this day after day, month after month, year after year, until one day my father died and left me $300 million. So I would just conclude by saying, you know, let's stop being so deferential to the rich and to the market that they control, the marketplace they control. Let's have confidence in ourselves and our abilities to build things together and to act collectively to create the kind of society that we really want. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. That was amazing, very interesting. And I know over my lifetime, some of these things I already knew, but you've kind of put the extra pieces in there of the puzzle that I didn't know. So I really appreciate that. So now we have time for some questions, and I'm going to start. If everyone would just kindly put their questions into the chat box, and I'll try to address them as soon as possible. But we already have one, and here's a question for you: is what are your thoughts on global health intelligence system that Canada Public Health developed and was scaled back during Harper years? This person then goes, the system could have been forewarned Canada of COVID.
Oh, this is such a tragic story. The Globe and Mail has done so much good work digging into this. It's absolutely true. We did have a global intelligence system that was really unusually good. It was considered advanced in terms of, you know, what other countries around the world had. And it was particularly looking out for exactly the kinds of problems that the pandemic has brought to us. And as the question points out, this was scaled back. It wasn't even a huge saving. I can't remember the exact amount, but it was, you know, it was part of the whole, Harper government austerity, deregulation, you know, cut back things, cut back monitoring of important dangers. It was just such a tragic change. And the people within that intelligence unit protested and tried to sound the alarm about how serious this was going to be, and they were just absolutely ignored. And that continued, by the way, under the Trudeau government. But the main blame I would definitely put on the Harper government. You know, this kind of thing, this global cooperation and global monitoring of healthcare needs is so important. I mean, I would go on and argue. I mean, we definitely have to reconstruct that incredible system that we had, you know, for future pandemics. But we also have to, you know, there's this whole movement with developing countries pressuring the advanced countries or the developed countries to give up the patent protections that, you know, these big pharma has for all these COVID vaccines, you know, which is such a, of course, an important idea. We have far too much patent protection, and then, you know, all the time, but particularly it would be so helpful during COVID. So before the World Trade Organization, India and South Africa are leading a push, and they have the support of the entire developed world to get the rich countries to stop backing pharmaceutical companies and protecting their patent rights. And again, just if I can refer to the breakthrough that we see to some extent with the Biden administration, the US was opposing that change in the patent laws, was, you know, not supporting the resolution by India and South Africa. And a couple of weeks ago, the Biden administration came out and announced it did support it, that it supported giving up that patent protection. It didn't say for everything, but for COVID vaccines. But Canada is still not supporting it. So anyway, I just think these kinds of things, international cooperation, stopping putting profits always before everything. And of course, it's particularly outrageous because so much of the costs of developing the COVID vaccine were paid for by government.
Yeah.
Thank you. Got a couple of more questions here. One is, what happened to the lawsuits for the nursing homes?
Okay. Well, that's an interesting question because what happened was, of course, people were when all these deaths started happening and the terrible conditions, there were a huge number of lawsuits. And what was the response of the the Ford government? What the Ford government did was bring in new legislation that made it harder to sue long-term care homes. It changed the protections that these companies enjoyed. So all those lawsuits, they can try and continue, but the terms, the chances of them winning are greatly reduced. And I haven't heard of any big wins, even though when you think about it, what could be more necessary than that those big chains be sued? But that's exactly what the Ford government did. And I didn't think that got as much attention as it should have. That was one of the first things they did in the early days of the pandemic, when it started to be clear how much of a problem, these nursing home situations were with COVID. What is their impulse? Is it to protect the people in those homes or the workers? No, it's to protect the corporate owners. Just stunning.
Thank you once again. We have another question. Is why does the government subsidize the oil industry to produce hydrogen from natural gas instead of making from renewables or sewage?
Well, I would imagine it's because we're not, taking the whole climate change threat seriously enough, and because of the private interests involved, the enormous, this government is so beholden to big business and what business wants, obviously the conservatives are worse, but the Trudeau government has this, presents itself as sort of progressive, and certainly compared to the conservatives, they do seem a lot worse. But where they're not progressive at all is anything to do with business. Like this whole thing about paying attention to what business wants versus what the public wants, or more broadly, or if I could just say, what is in the public interest. They will go with the powerful. I mean, look at something like the purchase of the Trans Mountain pipeline by the Trudeau government. Purchased that 2 years ago. Terrible decision. We have to overcome. We have to leave virtually all that oil in the ground and the oil sands if we're going to fight climate change. So the idea of building what they're doing with that Keystone pipeline, or not Keystone, sorry, Trans Mountain, is that they're tripling the capacity of oil moving through there. Well, that's no way to fight climate change. And this is the Trudeau government doing this as they say that they're, that they're fighting climate change. And the reason they did that was only because, the power of the corporate lobby. The Kinder Morgan, the company that owned that pipeline, they were so frustrated because they couldn't get the approvals they wanted, and they were going to walk away from the deal. They said, unless they got the approvals from Canada for all the go-ahead they wanted. So instead, what the Trudeau government does is come in and buy the pipeline from them, investing $12 billion to complete that pipeline, only to please the oil and gas industry. And by the way, there's, apart from the enormous problems that creates for climate change, it's just financially crazy. It's just using public money in order to help a very privileged elite of the mostly foreign-owned oil and gas industry. Yes, they always trot out the the workers, but the workers, there's relatively few workers in the oil and gas industry. This is about helping the corporation. So I guess, sorry, that's a long roundabout answer, but my point is the Trudeau government does things to meet the interest, to serve the interests of the powerful corporate elite with very little thought to the public interest.
Thank you once again. So we have one last question and then we'll wrap up. And so this individual says, I heard that it was Harper who privatized Connaught, not Harris in the 80s. Please clarify and please let us know what we can do to prevent privatization and address these issues.
Okay. Actually, it definitely wasn't Harper. The controversy, there's been a bit of controversy over this. Some people say it was Pierre Trudeau, not Mulroney. But that there's a little bit of truth in that, but overall it's not. I'll just quickly tell you what happened. It was Connaught was owned by the University of Toronto, and the corporate, the board at the University of Toronto was interested in selling it in the early 70s. And the Trudeau administration had just set up this organization, this agency to sort of take control of Canadian companies and make sure that they didn't fall into foreign hands. That's what the basic thing was about. So they bought Connaught from the University of Toronto. And so they sort of privatized it a bit, but they also maintained some government control. So Connaught was kind of in limbo in the 1970s. It was still owned, it was owned by the federal government, but it had been partially privatized. When the Mulroney government came along, they were gung-ho about privatization, Petro-Canada, Air Canada, and Connaught was one of the things they privatized. So it's definitely Mulroney who does the major privatization. Now, I think the final part of that question was, what can we do to prevent privatization and address these issues? Well, okay, that's the big question. And I guess I would argue, let's start by really talking about privatization. Privatization is kind of this thing that's out there in the air. Like, governments just are always saying, well, we'll get the private sector to do this, on the assumption that the private sector will do a better job and it'll be somehow in the public interest. And we see that with the new Canada Infrastructure Bank that they're structuring all about $35 billion of public money. And it's all basically going to ensuring that private developers get a big chunk of the infrastructure development. Let's start talking about this as an issue. It doesn't even get raised. We are hearing, we do get people protesting about tax cuts for the rich and social spending cuts, but we hear almost nothing about privatization. So I would start by saying, let's raise it as an issue. Let's focus on it, because I would argue it's absolutely central to our ability to get control of our economy and our society. It's something we really should be focusing on.
Okay. Linda, we have one more question. Do you have time for it?
Yeah.
Okay. So this person says, Linda's confidence in public corporations doesn't take into account the extra costs, bloated bureaucracies that I've seen at both the federal and municipal governments that I have worked for. Also, as a teacher, I have seen principals give up on disciplining and firing some teachers who are underperforming. And I had initial experience in a private school where principals were able to weed out teachers who were incompetent. The extra waste from these two things alone is probably equivalent to 7 to 9% profit, or quotation marks, waste given to private companies. And government is almost always slower than private industry in getting things done.
Well, I would say this is exactly what we hear all the time from the business community and from all kinds of ordinary people. Again, it's just people's opinions. There's no systematic evidence that that is true. When the Auditor General says that it's $8 billion more expensive to do things with by involving a private company in your infrastructure deals, because you have to build in this profit margin, that's pretty powerful. And if that, frankly, if that kind of thing had been reported by the Auditor General, let's say it was $8 billion more expensive because government was doing it, it would have been a huge story. It would have generated all kinds of front page news. But this was a one-day story and people just quickly moved on. I think the point is that if we look at these things in systematic ways, yes, we can, people want to believe that the private sector is, well-meaning. I'm sure there are individuals in it that are well-meaning, but overall, let's face it, what the difference is between a private and a public company, private and public enterprise, is that the private company, the bottom line is profit for the shareholders. That is what they care about. That's not the case with a public enterprise. Now, that doesn't mean public enterprises can't be bad. They can, and we should weed out the ones that are bad, get rid of bad management. But the whole notion that a private company its sole focus is on profits for its shareholders, that tells us a lot about what's wrong with trusting those companies too much for our well-being.
Thank you very much, Linda. I'm going to pass you now over to Mary for just the ending remarks.
Thank you, Debbie. And thank you so much, Linda. And incredible lecture, very thought-provoking, very insightful information that maybe some of us weren't aware of before in terms of the extent and privatization, particularly talking about Connaught Labs. And it's interesting, you don't really miss something until it's gone. And now we see with COVID and the pandemic that we're all struggling with in terms of having something like that. And interestingly, with our federal government now actually investing again in a laboratory, but privatization for more research. So thank you so much. You've presented a lot to think about. I wish we had a little bit more time to talk. There's quite a bit in your book. Linda's lecture today was from her book, The Sport and Prey of Capitalists. Have a copy of it. I've read through this. There's an amazing amount of material in here. I highly recommend the book if you are interested in learning more about some of the things that Linda has spoken about today. I want to say sincere thank you to Linda McQuaig for joining us today for today's guest lecture, and Deborah Bonk-Greenwood for moderating today's Q&A session, as well as from the Life Institute. Thank you so much, Deborah. And especially thank you to everyone for attending and joining us today on this call. I'm sure some of you may want to attend some of our future upcoming events. We do have quite a bit scheduled for June, and again, partnering with the Life Institute for a series of health lectures. So we encourage, if you are interested, to please check out, it has been entered in the chat box for contacting us, the website, as well as signing up for any events that you might be interested in. There will also be a follow-up email going out, as well as a survey within the next 24 to 48 hours. We really encourage you to please fill out your survey for us, provide us with some feedback. We would like to hold more lectures like this with Linda today. So please do provide your feedback and comments in the survey and let us know your thoughts and any upcoming topics or some of the things we may have talked about today that you may want to revisit for a future lecture. So in closing, on behalf of the Chang School at Ryerson University, the Life Institute, and our presenter today, Linda McQuaig, thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope you'll enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.